Admiral Lisa Hayes sat at the head of the long table in the Terran Defense Council chamber, deep beneath Geneva. The room was filled with the most important military and scientific leaders on Earth, all of them studying the holographic displays that showed the Devourer threat. 3 weeks had passed since Captain Morrison's message arrived from Unity Prime, and the situation looked worse with each new report. General Kevin Brooks pointed at the tactical display with his laser pointer. Our intelligence analysis shows that humanity has 300 combat-ready vessels scattered across 12 systems. The Devourers have destroyed alien fleets numbering in the thousands. We're looking at impossible odds. The numbers were sobering. Earth's space navy had been built for exploration and light patrol duties, not for fighting an enemy that had consumed entire civilizations. Most human ships were frigates and destroyers designed for dealing with pirates and asteroid mining disputes. Chief Engineer Maria Santos stood up and walked to the display. She had spent the last 3 weeks studying every piece of alien technology that humans had access to, and what she had found surprised her. "The problem isn't that we're outgunned," she said, touching the hologram to bring up technical specifications. "The problem is that every species in the galaxy fights the same way." Admiral Hayes leaned forward in her chair. Maria was known for seeing things that others missed, and her insights had saved human lives more than once during the early years of galactic contact. "Look at this," Maria continued, pulling up weapon designs from a dozen different alien species. Energy lances, plasma cannons, particle beams, and force field disruptors. They all work on the same basic principles. They all manipulate electromagnetic fields or directed energy. Dr. Helen Price, the head of Earth's Xenobiology Research Division, nodded in agreement. "I've been studying the wreckage from Devourer, encounters that the aliens provided us. These creatures are incredibly adaptive, but their adaptations follow patterns. They develop resistance to energy weapons by adjusting their electromagnetic properties. They counter force fields by phase shifting into subspace. Commander Rick Taylor, a former Marine who now planned spacecraft tactics, saw where this was going. They've never encountered human military doctrine because no other species fights like we do." The room fell quiet as everyone considered the implications. Human warfare had developed along completely different lines than alien combat. Earth's violent history had produced weapons and tactics that other species considered primitive or barbaric. Dr. Carol Jensen joined the discussion from her research station in orbit. Her image appeared on the main screen, and Jake could see the excitement in her eyes. "I've been analyzing the quantum signatures from Devourer attacks. These creatures exist partially in subspace, which makes them nearly invulnerable to conventional energy weapons, but subspace has limitations." She brought up a 3-dimensional model showing the mathematical relationship between normal space and subspace. Human quantum tunnel drive technology works by creating temporary rifts between dimensions. If we could modify our drives to create disruption fields instead of travel portals, we might be able to lock the Devourers in normal space. Admiral Hayes studied the faces around the table. These were the people who had built humanity's presence in space from nothing. They had solved problems that alien species said were impossible, using approaches that others had never considered. "What are our advantages?" she asked. Rick Taylor was the first to respond. "Chemical explosives. Every alien species we've met uses energy-based weapons because they're more efficient and easier to control. But chemical explosives don't rely on electromagnetic fields or particle streams. They work through simple chemical reactions that release kinetic energy." Maria Santos added to the list. "Kinetic weapons, railguns, and mass drivers that accelerate solid projectiles to high speeds. The aliens consider them primitive because energy weapons have better range and accuracy. But kinetic weapons don't care about adaptive shielding or electromagnetic countermeasures." Dr. Price brought up another advantage: nuclear weapons. Most alien species developed fusion power before. They developed nuclear weapons, so they never went through the same arms race that Earth experienced. They know about nuclear fusion, but they've never weaponized it the way humans have. The conversation continued for hours as the group identified dozens of technologies and tactics that were uniquely human. Biological warfare, electromagnetic, Pulse weapons, gravity bombs, and even simple projectile weapons like bullets and missiles. All of these were considered outdated or primitive by galactic standards, but they had never been used against the Devourers. Dr. Jensen's voice came through the speakers again. "I've been working on something else. The Devourers use subspace to coordinate their attacks across vast distances. They're like a hive mind that can communicate instantly across the galaxy. But if we could disrupt their subspace connections, they might become vulnerable to conventional tactics." Admiral Hayes made her decision. "We're not going to wait for someone else to save the galaxy. If humanity is going to survive this threat, we need to become our own heroes." She looked around the table at each person. "I want proposals for new weapon systems that use human technology. I want our shipyards converted to military production. And I want our best tactical minds working on ways to fight an enemy that no one has ever defeated." The meeting broke up as people hurried to their assignments, but Rick Taylor remained behind to speak with Admiral Hayes privately. "You realize what we're planning to do," he said quietly. "We're going to introduce human warfare to the galaxy. Some of our tactics are going to horrify the other species." Lisa Hayes nodded grimly. "I'd rather horrify our allies than let the Devourers consume everything. Sometimes being a hero means making choices that others won't make." Over the following weeks, Earth transformed into a military production center, unlike anything in its history. Shipyards that had been building exploration vessels started constructing warships armed with railguns and missile tubes. Factories that produced mining equipment began making armor-piercing rounds and nuclear warheads. Commander Janet Morris, who had been studying alien battle tactics, proposed something radical. Instead of trying to match alien energy weapons, human ships should be designed around kinetic combat. Heavy armor, multiple redundant systems, and weapons that didn't rely on exotic physics. Captain Robert Hayes led the team designing new ship classes. The first prototype was called the Defiance, a destroyer built like a flying fortress. Its hull was layered with composite armor that could stop energy weapons, and its weapon systems included both long-range missiles and close-range railguns. Lieutenant Scott Adams worked on communication systems that could coordinate human fleets without using subspace networks. If the Devourers could intercept or disrupt alien communications, human forces needed independent ways to share information during battle. Dr. Price made another important discovery while studying Devourer biology. The creatures reproduced by consuming matter and energy from destroyed planets. They were not just destroyers, but also parasites that needed to feed on civilization to survive. This meant they had to continue attacking inhabited systems, which made their movements somewhat predictable. The breakthrough came when Dr. Jensen successfully tested her quantum disruption field generator. The device could create a localized area where subspace travel was impossible, effectively trapping the Devourers in normal space where conventional weapons could reach them. Admiral Hayes stood on the observation deck of the orbital shipyard and watched the first human battle fleet take shape. 24 ships designed specifically for fighting the Devourers, armed with weapons that no other species had ever used in space combat. Captain Morrison's latest message from Unity Prime was encouraging. The alien species were grateful for humanity's commitment to help, but they still expected the humans to fight like everyone else. They had no idea that Earth was preparing to introduce an entirely different approach to warfare. "We're going to surprise everyone," Admiral Hayes said to herself as she watched the fleet prepare for its first mission. The galaxy had waited for prophesied heroes to save them, but humanity was about to prove that heroes were made through determination and innovation, not destiny. The first human strike force would launch within the month, carrying weapons and tactics that had never been tested against the Devourers. It was a risk that could save the galaxy or doom humanity to the same fate that had befallen so many other species. But Admiral Hayes had learned something important during her years in space. Sometimes the biggest risk was not taking any risk at all. The galaxy needed heroes and humanity was ready to become them. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the window of his ship and watched Unity Prime grow larger as they approached. The massive space station looked like a giant wheel spinning slowly around a bright neutron star. Its metal corridors gleamed in the HFY strange light, and Jake could see dozens of different alien ships docked at its many ports. He had never seen anything like it in his 42 years of life. The human transport vessel Aurora moved carefully toward the docking bay. Jake's diplomatic team sat quietly behind him, all of them nervous about this meeting. They had received an urgent message from the Galactic Council 3 weeks ago, asking for immediate human representation. The message had been marked as highest priority, which meant something big was happening. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez checked her datapad for the 100th time. As the team's expert on alien life, she had studied every species they might meet today. The Zephyrians were tall and had blue skin that could change color based on their emotions. The Nexari looked like metal beings but were actually made of living crystal. The Mindari appeared almost human except for their large black eyes that could see into people's thoughts. Dr. Paul Carter adjusted his glasses and reviewed his notes about galactic history. He was the smartest person Jake knew, with 3 degrees in different sciences. Paul had spent years studying the old texts and legends that many alien races shared. Some of these stories went back millions of years, passed down from one generation to the next. The Aurora docked with a soft thud that Jake felt through the ship's hull. He straightened his uniform and took a deep breath. Whatever the Galactic Council wanted, humanity would listen. They had been part of this galactic community for only 50 years, which made them newcomers compared to species that had been traveling between stars for thousands of centuries. Unity Prime's corridors were wider than any hallway Jake had ever walked through. The ceiling rose high above their heads and the walls were covered in symbols from hundreds of different languages. Alien beings moved past them in groups, some walking, others floating, and a few that seemed to flow like liquid across the floor. Council Speaker Veltar met them at the entrance to the Great Assembly Hall. The crystalline being stood nearly 8 feet tall, his body made of what looked like living diamond that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. When he spoke, his voice sounded like music mixed with the ringing of bells. "Humans of Earth," Veltar said, his crystal face showing what Jake thought might be relief. "We have waited for you to arrive. Please follow me to the assembly chamber where the full council waits." The assembly hall was enormous, with seats arranged in circles that rose up toward the curved ceiling. Representatives from over 200 different species sat in those seats, and Jake realized that every one of them was looking at the small human delegation. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he kept his face calm and professional. Veltar moved to the center of the hall where a platform of light held him suspended above the floor. His crystalline body began to glow brighter as he prepared to speak, and the hall fell completely silent. "Fellow beings of the galaxy," Veltar began, his musical voice carrying clearly to every corner of the great room, "we face the darkest hour in our recorded history. For 300 years we have waited for salvation. For 300 years we have hoped that the great defenders spoken of in our most ancient prophecies would come to save us from the terror that consumes worlds." Jake felt Amy shift beside him. She had read about these prophecies during their journey to Unity Prime. Every major species in the galaxy had similar stories about powerful beings who would arrive from the outer rim of space to defend civilization when it faced its greatest threat. "The Devourers have returned," Veltar continued, and Jake heard gasps from around the hall. "They have already consumed 17 star systems in the past year. Our greatest fleets have been destroyed. Our most powerful weapons have proven useless. Our wisest minds cannot understand how to stop them." On the great display screens around the hall, images appeared showing the aftermath of Devourer attacks. Where once there had been planets and stars, now there was only empty space. Not even debris remained. Whatever these creatures were, they left nothing behind. A Zephyrian admiral stood up from his seat, his blue skin turning dark purple with fear. "The Devourers adapt to every weapon we use against them," he said in a voice that shook with emotion. "Energy weapons, kinetic missiles, even psychic attacks become useless after the first few hits. They learn and change faster than we can develop new tactics." Dr. Carter leaned over and whispered to Jake, "The legends say the great defenders will come from beyond the outer rim, bringing new ways of fighting that the enemy has never seen before." Jake nodded but felt a cold weight in his stomach. Earth was not beyond the outer rim. Humanity came from a small system in what most species considered the galaxy's backwater regions. Veltar's crystalline form pulsed with desperate hope as he looked directly at the human delegation. The ancient texts speak of beings who think differently than the rest of us, beings who approach problems in ways that have never been tried before. The prophecies say they will arrive when all seems lost, bringing salvation to the galaxy. Amy studied the data she had gathered about the Devourers. The creatures seemed to exist partly in normal space and partly in something called subspace. They could phase in and out of reality, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. Every species that had fought them used similar technologies based on energy manipulation and directed force fields. Paul was thinking about the same problem from a different angle. He had noticed something interesting in his research about galactic civilizations. Despite their vast differences in appearance and culture, most alien species had developed along similar paths. They had all discovered energy weapons first, then force fields, then faster-than-light travel using subspace manipulation. It was as if there was only one way to become advanced. But humans had taken a different path. Earth's history was full of conflict, and humanity had developed dozens of different ways to fight. Chemical explosives, kinetic weapons, biological warfare, nuclear fusion, and electromagnetic pulse devices were all part of human military knowledge. Most alien species considered these approaches primitive and barbaric. Jake realized that Veltar was waiting for a response. The entire Galactic Council was looking at him with hope in their eyes, expecting him to confirm that humanity was indeed the prophesied great defenders. He could see the desperation in their faces, the fear that had been building for centuries as they waited for salvation. He made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Speaker Veltar, honored members of the council, Jake said, standing up so his voice would carry throughout the hall. Humanity will study this threat and provide whatever assistance we can. We cannot promise to be the heroes you seek, but we will not abandon our allies in their time of need. The hall erupted in sounds of relief and gratitude. Beings that had been on the edge of despair now wept with joy. For the first time in 3 centuries, someone had offered to help instead of simply fleeing from the threat. As Jake watched the celebration around him, he knew he had just committed humanity to a fight they might not be able to win. But he also knew that sometimes the greatest heroes were the ones who stepped forward, not because they were destined to win, but because it was the right thing to do. Captain Susan Clark stood on the bridge of the destroyer Defiance and watched the Kepler system grow larger on the main screen. 6 months had passed since Admiral Hayes had ordered the construction of humanity's first anti-devourer fleet, and now 12 human warships moved through space toward their first real test. The human fleet looked nothing like the graceful alien vessels they had seen at Unity Prime. These ships were angular and heavily armored, with thick hulls designed to absorb punishment rather than avoid it. Instead of the smooth energy weapon ports that other species preferred, human ships bristled with missile tubes, railgun turrets, and nuclear torpedo launchers. Sergeant Tony Garcia checked his weapon systems from the gunnery station. His grandmother had died during the last Great War on Earth, and he had joined the Space Service to make sure that human families would never face such loss again. The railgun he controlled could fire depleted uranium slugs at nearly 20% of light speed, creating impacts that would punch through almost any known material. Lieutenant Beth Turner monitored the communications array that kept the human fleet connected without using subspace networks. At 26 years old, she was the youngest officer in the fleet, but her skills with quantum-encrypted communications had earned her a place on the mission. If the Devourers could intercept alien communications, human forces needed their own, secure methods of coordination. The target was a Devourer scout force that had been attacking the outer planets of the Kepler system. 3 separate alien fleets had already tried to stop them, and all 3 had been completely destroyed. The Zephyrian Navy had lost 40 ships in the most recent battle, including their flagship and most experienced crews. Admiral Krikstal of the Zephyrian fleet met them at the edge of the system. His remaining ships were damaged and barely functional, but he had refused to abandon the civilian populations on the inner planets. When Captain Clark explained the human battle plan, the alien admiral's blue skin turned pale with disbelief. "You plan to attack them with kinetic weapons and chemical explosives?" Krikstal asked, his translator making his voice sound confused and concerned. "These creatures adapt to any attack within minutes. My energy lances became useless after the first engagement. Your primitive weapons will fare no better." Captain Clark understood his skepticism. Human military doctrine was based on principles that other species had abandoned millions of years ago. But she had studied the reports from every devourer encounter, and she had noticed something that the aliens had missed. "Admiral, every species that has fought the devourers has used the same basic approach: energy weapons, force fields, and subspace manipulation. The creatures have had centuries to develop countermeasures for those technologies, but they've never encountered human warfare." The Zephyrian admiral remained doubtful, but he agreed to support the human attack with his remaining ships. His crews were exhausted and demoralized, but they were willing to try anything that might save their worlds. The devourers appeared exactly when human intelligence predicted they would. 5 massive creatures emerged from subspace near the system's 4th planet, their surfaces shifting and changing as they moved through space. Each one was the size of a large asteroid, part organic growth and part mechanical construct, with weapons that could destroy entire cities with single shots. Lieutenant Commander Steve Roberts, commanding the missile cruiser Intrepid, was the first to see them clearly on his ship's sensors. The creatures looked like nightmares made real, with tentacles that crackled with energy and hull surfaces that seemed to flow like liquid metal. But Steve had seen worse things during his years fighting pirates in the asteroid belt, and he was not impressed by their size. The Zephyrian fleet attacked first, following their standard tactical doctrine. Energy lances and plasma cannons created brilliant displays of light as they struck the devourers' adaptive hulls. For a few seconds, the attack seemed to be working, burning holes in the creatures' surfaces and causing them to writhe in apparent pain. Then the devourers adapted. Their hull composition changed, becoming reflective to energy weapons. The plasma bolts that had been effective moments before now bounced harmlessly off their surfaces. The creatures turned toward the Zephyrian ships and began to return fire, with weapons that tore through alien hulls like paper. Captain Clark watched the alien attack fail exactly as she had expected it would. "All human vessels, this is Defiance. Execute attack pattern Alpha. Target the lead creature with everything we have." The Defiance opened fire with its main railgun, sending a depleted uranium slug toward the largest devourer at tremendous speed. The creature's adaptive shielding, designed to counter energy weapons and force fields, offered no protection against a solid projectile traveling at relativistic speeds. The impact was spectacular. The uranium slug punched completely through the devourer's hull, creating a tunnel that extended from one side of the creature to the other. Organic fluids and mechanical components spilled out into space, and the creature's coordinated movement became erratic and confused. Steve Roberts followed up immediately with a spread of nuclear-tipped missiles from the Intrepid. The devourers attempted to phase shift into subspace to avoid the attack, but Dr. Jensen's quantum disruption field generators activated at the same moment, locking the creatures in normal space. The nuclear explosions that followed sent shockwaves through the enemy formation. The devourers had never encountered fusion weapons before, and their adaptive systems couldn't compensate fast enough for the intense heat and radiation. 2 of the creatures were severely damaged, their hull integrity compromised and their weapon systems offline. Sergeant Garcia watched his targeting display with satisfaction as his railgun found its mark again and again. Each uranium slug tore new holes in the devourer hulls, and the creatures seemed unable to adapt to the simple kinetic impacts. Their sophisticated defensive systems were designed for complex energy attacks, not for dealing with high-speed chunks of metal. The remaining devourers tried to coordinate a counterattack, but Lieutenant Turner's communication jamming systems disrupted their subspace coordination signals. The creatures, accustomed to fighting as a unified hive mind, suddenly found themselves operating as individuals against a coordinated human fleet. Captain Clark ordered her ships to close the distance and engage with their secondary weapons. Chemical explosive warheads, electromagnetic pulse generators, and even simple projectile weapons added to the chaos. The Devourers, faced with a dozen different types of attacks they had never encountered before, began to retreat. For the first time in galactic history, Devourer blood spilled in space. The creatures that had consumed entire civilizations were wounded, confused, and afraid. They attempted to flee into subspace, but the quantum disruption fields prevented their escape. Admiral Kriegstahl watched in amazement as the human fleet systematically destroyed 3 of the 5 Devourers. The remaining 2 creatures, badly damaged and unable to coordinate their efforts, finally managed to escape by overloading their subspace drives and accepting massive internal damage in the process. The battle was over in less than 30 minutes, but its implications would be felt across the galaxy. Captain Clark ordered damage reports from all human vessels and was pleased to learn that only minor injuries had occurred among her crews. The Defiance had taken some energy weapon hits, but her heavy armor had absorbed the damage without compromising ship operations. Admiral Kriegstahl, Captain Clark said over the communication link, "Please send word to Unity Prime that the first human engagement with the Devourers was successful. We destroyed 3 enemy vessels and forced the others to retreat." The Zephyrian Admiral's blue skin had turned bright gold with amazement and gratitude. "Captain Clark, in 300 years of galactic history, no one has ever defeated the Devourers in open battle. Your species has accomplished something that we thought was impossible." As the human fleet regrouped and prepared for the journey home, Captain Clark reflected on what they had learned. The Devourers were not invincible. They were simply prepared for the wrong kind of war. They had adapted to counter the energy-based warfare that dominated galactic military thinking, but they had no defense against human kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. Lieutenant Turner received priority communications from Earth, Unity Prime, and dozens of other systems as news of the victory spread. The message was the same everywhere. Hope had returned to the galaxy for the first time in centuries. But Captain Clark knew this was only the beginning. The human fleet had defeated a small scouting force, but intelligence reports suggested that thousands of Devourer hives were scattered throughout the galaxy. The real war was just starting, and humanity would need to be ready for whatever came next. The trip back to Earth took 2 weeks, and when the human fleet arrived at the orbital shipyards, they found the entire solar system transformed. Hundreds of new warships were under construction, all of them designed around the lessons learned from the Kepler engagement. Admiral Hayes met Captain Clark personally when she disembarked from the Defiance. "Susan, you and your crews have given us something more valuable than victory. You've given us proof that the Devourers can be beaten. Now we need to figure out how to win a war." News of the human victory at Kepler spread across the galaxy faster than anyone had expected. On Unity Prime, Council Speaker Veltar addressed representatives from 200 species, with something that had not been heard in their great assembly hall for over 3 centuries. Genuine hope mixed with excited chatter about tactical possibilities they had never considered. But not everyone was celebrating the human success. Ambassador Throndar of the Ancient Eternals sat in his private chambers, studying reports of the battle with growing concern. His species had ruled the galactic core for over 1,000,000 years, and they had never encountered beings who approached warfare the way humans did. The Eternals had developed their military doctrine around principles of honor and efficiency. War was a precise art form with established rules that civilized species followed. Energy weapons were clean and allowed for surgical precision. Force fields provided elegant defense. Subspace manipulation enabled rapid tactical movement. Human warfare was none of these things. Chemical explosives were destructive and unpredictable. Kinetic weapons were crude and wasteful. Nuclear fusion bombs were the kind of weapons that primitive species used before they learned better methods. "They fight like barbarians," Throndar said to his aide, reviewing footage of human ships firing solid projectiles at the Devourers. "There is no elegance in their methods, no respect for the proper conduct of battle." On Earth, the victory had energized the entire planet in ways that surprised even the military leadership. President William Foster addressed the Global Assembly with news that 12 major corporations had volunteered to convert their entire production capacity to military manufacturing. The Luna shipyards, which had been building civilian transports and mining vessels, were now producing destroyers and cruisers at a rate that impressed even the engineers who had designed the facilities. Mars Colony had offered its entire output of refined metals for warship construction. Commander Linda Wong had been promoted to head the new Tactical Research Division, a department that existed to develop increasingly creative solutions to the Devourer threat. Her team included former military officers, civilian engineers, and even some reformed criminals whose understanding of unconventional tactics proved valuable in developing new strategies. The key to fighting the Devourers is unpredictability, Linda explained to her research team during a planning session. Every time we use a new weapon or tactic, we have a brief window before they can adapt. We need to have dozens of different approaches ready to deploy. The team had already developed several promising concepts: gravity bombs that could create artificial black holes, biological warfare agents designed to attack the organic components of Devourer hulls, electromagnetic pulse weapons that could disrupt their subspace coordination systems. But the most ambitious project was taking place in the outer system, where Dr. Jensen led a team of scientists working on something called the Stellar Disruption Array. The concept was simple in theory but incredibly dangerous in practice. Use modified mining charges to destabilize a star's core, creating a controlled supernova that could destroy entire Devourer hives. Admiral Morrison, now promoted after his diplomatic success at Unity Prime, received reports that a major Devourer concentration had established itself in the Vega system. Long-range sensors showed dozens of the creatures clustered around Vega's primary star, apparently feeding on its energy output while using the system as a staging area for attacks on nearby colonies. The target represented both an opportunity and a test. If human forces could destroy a major Devourer hive, it would prove that their tactics could work on a larger scale. But failure would likely result in the complete destruction of humanity's growing fleet. Morrison assembled a force of 60 human warships supported by alien auxiliary vessels from 12 different species. The alien crews were volunteers who wanted to fight alongside the species that had proven the Devourers could be defeated. Captain Rodriguez, now commanding the heavy cruiser Valiant, led one of the assault squadrons. Her ship carried the latest human weapons technology, including quantum disruption torpedoes that could lock Devourers in normal space and gravity mines that created localized space-time distortions. The battle plan was audacious, even by human standards. Instead of attacking the Devourer hive directly, the fleet would target Vega itself. Using Dr. Jensen's stellar disruption charges, they would destabilize the star's core and trigger a controlled supernova that would destroy everything within 3 light-years of the system. The risks were enormous. The fleet would have less than 10 minutes to escape the system after detonating the charges, and any ships that failed to reach safe distance would be vaporized, along with the Devourers. Commander Morris, now serving as Morrison's tactical officer, ran final calculations on her computer systems. Admiral will have approximately 9 minutes and 40 seconds from detonation to supernova. All ships will need to be beyond the 4 light-year mark to survive the explosion. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the Vega system to find a nightmare scenario waiting for them. 47 Devourer vessels of various sizes clustered around the primary star, some of them larger than any creatures previously encountered. Long-range scans showed that they were constructing some kind of massive structure in orbit around Vega, possibly a staging facility for major attacks on the galactic core. Admiral Morrison gave the order to begin the attack. Human ships moved. In coordinated groups, each squadron tasked with delivering stellar disruption charges to specific points around Vega's surface. The Devourers detected the approaching fleet and moved to intercept, but they were too late to prevent the humans from reaching their target. Captain Rodriguez led her squadron through intense enemy fire to reach the star's northern hemisphere. Devourer energy weapons tore at her ship's hull, but the Valiant's heavy armor absorbed the damage while her crew worked to deploy their charges. The stellar disruption devices were based on technology that had been developed for asteroid mining, but modified to work on a much larger scale. When activated, They would create cascade failures in the star's fusion processes, leading to core instability and eventual supernova. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, now commanding the destroyer Triumph, successfully deployed his charges on the star's southern pole despite losing his ship's main engines to Devourer fire. His crew worked frantically to restart their propulsion systems while enemy vessels closed in around them. The critical moment came when all 24 disruption charges activated simultaneously. Vega's surface erupted in massive solar flares as the star's fusion processes began to destabilize. The Devourers, sensing the danger, abandoned their attacks on the human fleet and attempted to flee the system. But Dr. Jensen's quantum disruption field generators activated at the same moment, creating a system-wide barrier that prevented subspace travel. The Devourers found themselves trapped in normal space with a star that was about to explode. Admiral Morrison ordered the fleet to retreat at maximum speed. Human ships, their missions complete, began the desperate race to reach safe distance before Vega went supernova. Some vessels damaged during the fighting struggled to maintain the necessary acceleration. The destroyer Triumph, with its damaged engines, began to fall behind the rest of the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Hayes made the decision that would haunt Admiral Morrison for the rest of his life. He ordered his crew to abandon ship while he remained behind to manually overload the ship's reactor, creating a localized explosion that would give his crew's escape pods the extra velocity they needed to reach safety. 8 minutes after the charges detonated, Vega collapsed into itself and then exploded outward with the force of 1 billion nuclear weapons. The supernova consumed the entire Devourer hive, along with their mysterious construction project and any hope they had of coordinating attacks from that region of space. 57 human ships successfully escaped the blast zone. The Triumph and 2 other vessels were lost, along with their crews, but their sacrifice had saved 17 inhabited systems from Devourer attacks. The memorial service for the fallen was held on Unity Prime, with representatives from every member species of the Galactic Council in attendance. Admiral Morrison read the names of the dead while Council Speaker Veltar translated the ceremony into hundreds of different languages. For the first time in galactic history, alien species mourned alongside humans for warriors who had died defending civilizations that were not their own. The gesture meant more to humanity than any formal recognition or reward could have. But the war was far from over. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive Devourer movements throughout the galaxy as the individual hives began to coordinate their efforts. Intelligence reports suggested that the creatures were preparing for a final assault on Unity Prime itself. If the Galactic Council fell, organized resistance would collapse and the galaxy would be defenseless against the Devourer swarms. The Void-R next battle would determine whether civilization survived or whether the ancient prophecies had been wrong about humanity's role as the Great Defenders. Admiral Morrison stood in his quarters aboard the flagship Liberty and studied tactical displays, showing Devourer movements across 12 sectors. The largest fleet in galactic history assembled around Unity Prime, like a protective shield made of metal and determination. 2,000 ships from dozens of different species formed defensive formations around the massive space station. But everyone knew that the outcome would be decided by the 300 human vessels at the fleet's core. Admiral Morrison commanded from the flagship Liberty, a massive dreadnought that had been built specifically for this final battle. The ship represented everything that human engineering could accomplish when survival was at stake. Its hull was layered with composite armor that could absorb tremendous punishment, and its weapon systems included technologies that had never been tested in actual combat. Commander Janet Morris, now serving as the Liberty's tactical officer, studied the sensor displays that showed enemy movements throughout the system. Her grandmother had survived the siege of Luna Colony during Earth's last major war, and Janet had inherited both her tactical skills and her determination to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. Captain Robert Hayes, the ship's chief engineer, monitored the revolutionary weapon systems that he had helped design. The Liberty carried gravitational disruptors that could create artificial black holes, quantum torpedoes that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and even an experimental device that could manipulate the fundamental forces of physics within a localized area. Lieutenant Scott Adams coordinated communications between 37 different alien species, each with their own languages, tactical doctrines, and cultural approaches to warfare. His job was to make sure that when the battle began, everyone would work together instead of fighting as separate groups. The enemy arrived like a plague that had consumed half the galaxy. 10,000 Devourer vessels emerged from subspace simultaneously, their combined mass so enormous that they blocked out entire sections of stars. The creatures had evolved since the early human victories, developing new hull configurations and weapon systems designed to counter kinetic attacks and nuclear explosives. But humanity had evolved too. Dr. Jensen, now commanding the science vessel, Discovery, activated the most ambitious project in human history, a network of quantum field generators that created a galaxy-wide subspace disruption field. The technology was based on principles that had been discovered during the development of faster-than-light travel, but modified to work on an unprecedented scale. The effect was immediate and devastating to Devourer coordination. The creatures, who had relied on subspace communication to operate as a unified hive mind, suddenly found themselves isolated and unable to share tactical information. For the first time in their existence, they were forced to fight as individuals rather than as a coordinated swarm. Captain Sarah Mitchell, commanding the experimental ship Prometheus, led the first wave of the human attack. Her vessel carried the most advanced weapons that Earth could produce, including antimatter torpedoes and devices that could manipulate gravity itself. The Prometheus had been designed for one specific mission: to penetrate the Devourer formation and target their command vessels. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Human ships armed with weapons that defied conventional understanding tore into the Devourer swarms. Gravity bombs created localized space-time distortions that crushed entire groups of enemy vessels. Quantum disruptors caused Devourer hulls to phase in and out of existence until their molecular structure collapsed. Lieutenant Commander Wong, now commanding the destroyer Intrepid, led her squadron through the enemy formation using tactics that would have horrified military theorists from any other species. Chemical explosive warheads, electromagnetic pulse generators, and kinetic bombardment systems created chaos among creatures that had expected to face energy weapons and force fields. The Devourers attempted to adapt to human tactics, but Dr. Jensen's disruption field prevented them from sharing information about countermeasures. Each creature had to develop its own defensive solutions, a process that took precious time, while human weapons continued to tear through their formations. Admiral Morrison watched the battle unfold from the Liberty's command center and realized that humanity was witnessing the end of an age. The Devourers had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, consuming entire civilizations and growing stronger with each victory. Now they faced an enemy they could not understand or predict, and their ancient advantages were becoming weaknesses. But the enemy was not defeated yet. The largest Devourer vessel, a creature the size of a small moon, began to emit energy patterns that Admiral Morrison's sensors could not identify. The massive being seemed to be attempting some kind of desperate final attack that could destroy Unity Prime and everyone defending it. Captain Mitchell saw the threat developing and made a decision that would be remembered for as long as civilized beings studied courage and sacrifice. She ordered the Prometheus to intercept the giant Devourer, knowing that her ship alone could not survive a direct confrontation with something so massive. "Admiral Morrison," she said over the communication system, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "The Prometheus is moving to engage the command vessel. If we can disrupt its coordination efforts, the remaining Devourers might lose their ability to function as an organized force." Morrison understood what she was planning. "Captain Mitchell, that's a suicide mission. The Prometheus cannot possibly survive an attack on something that large." Sarah Mitchell smiled, though no one else could see her face. "Admiral, sometimes being a hero means doing what needs to be done regardless of the cost. My crew and I volunteered for this mission knowing the risks. We're ready to do our duty." The Prometheus accelerated toward the giant Devourer at maximum speed, its hull glowing from the energy weapons that struck it from all directions. Captain Mitchell's crew worked with desperate efficiency to prepare their most powerful weapon, an experimental exotic matter warhead that had never been tested outside of computer simulations. The device was based on theoretical physics that most scientists said was too dangerous to weaponize. When detonated, it would create a microscopic black hole that would exist for only a few seconds before evaporating, but during that time it would consume everything within a significant radius. Captain Mitchell guided her ship through the Devourer's defensive fire and into the creature's central hull structure. The Prometheus's armor held just long enough for her to activate the exotic matter device and transmit a final message to the fleet. "Tell Earth that we did our job," she said simply, and then the communication went silent. The explosion that followed was visible throughout the solar system. The microscopic black hole consumed the giant Devourer from the inside out, creating a cascade effect that destroyed dozens of smaller creatures that had been coordinating with the command vessel. With their central intelligence destroyed and their subspace communications still disrupted, the remaining Devourers lost their ability to function as a unified force. Individual creatures began to retreat, fleeing back toward the galactic rim where they had come from generations ago. The battle was over. Humanity and its allies had achieved something that no one had thought possible. They had defeated the Devourers in open warfare and saved the galactic civilization from destruction. In the aftermath, as medical ships moved through the battlefield to rescue survivors and recover the dead, Admiral Morrison reflected on the cost of victory. Over 400 ships had been destroyed during the fighting, and thousands of beings from dozens of species had given their lives to protect their homes and families. But they had also accomplished something that would change the galaxy forever. The ancient prophecies spoke of great defenders who would arrive from the outer rim to save civilization in its darkest hour. But the prophecies had gotten one important detail wrong. The great defenders had not come from beyond the rim of the galaxy. They had come from within it, from a small blue planet whose people refused to wait for someone else to save them. Council Speaker Veltar addressed the survivors of the Great Battle from the Assembly Hall of Unity Prime. His crystalline form glowed with emotions that humans were still learning to interpret, but his words were clear in every language that had ever been spoken. "The ancient texts told us that heroes would come to save us in our time of greatest need," he said, his musical voice carrying throughout the hall and across the communication networks that connected hundreds of worlds. But the texts were incomplete. They did not tell us that the greatest heroes would be those who chose to become heroes not because they were destined for greatness, but because it was the right thing to do. Admiral Morrison stood with the other human representatives as Veltar continued his address. Around them sat beings from every corner of the galaxy, all of them united by the shared experience of surviving a threat that had once seemed insurmountable. "Today, we add new words to the ancient prophecies," Veltar announced. Others waited for heroes to save them. Humans became their own heroes, and in doing so, saved everyone else. The ceremony continued for hours as the galaxy honored its dead and celebrated its survival, but Morrison's thoughts were focused on the future.